3:47 a.m., November 15th, 1988, Baikonur Cosmodrome, Kazakhstan. Outside, it's minus 18 degrees Celsius. Inside the assembly hall, 40 engineers stare at monitors, watching telemetry from a spacecraft that shouldn't exist. The Buran orbiter sits on the launch pad, 2,400 tons of metal, ceramic tiles, and pure Soviet ambition. The engines ignite. The ground shakes. 30 million horsepower pushes the shuttle into the dawn sky. And for 206 minutes, the Soviet Union proves it can match anything America builds. The orbiter completes 2 orbits, re-enters the atmosphere at 28,000 kilometers per hour, and lands itself with a precision of just 10 meters from the target, fully automated. No pilot touching the controls. The engineers in mission control don't celebrate. They already know what the politicians haven't admitted yet. This is the first and last flight. The program is dying before it even reaches orbit. By 2002, the hangar roof would collapse, crushing the only shuttle that ever flew, burying it under 12,000 tons of concrete and steel. The men who built Buran believed they were building the future of Soviet space exploration. The collapse was inevitable, but nobody wanted to see it coming. I love diving into the real stories behind humanity's most ambitious engineering projects and the massive industrial complexes they left behind. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me which abandoned space facility you want me to explore next. Every like and subscription helps me bring these deep historical investigations to life. Thanks for watching. Now let's get into it. The first sound you heard wasn't the rocket engines. It was the silence that came after. The silence of a program too expensive to continue, too political to cancel outright. When the Americans launched the Space Shuttle Columbia in April 1981, Soviet leadership panicked. Not because the shuttle was revolutionary, but because they didn't know what it was really for. The official story was civilian, a reusable spacecraft for space station servicing and satellite deployment. The unofficial fear in Moscow was military, an orbital weapons platform, a satellite capturing machine, or even a vehicle for a surprise nuclear first strike. The shuttle's cargo bay was big enough to carry a nuclear warhead. Its maneuverability during re-entry could theoretically allow it to drop weapons over Soviet territory with minimal warning. Whether the Americans actually intended any of this didn't matter. Soviet strategic doctrine required matching any potential threat. If America could build a reusable spacecraft, the USSR had to build one too. Not because it made economic sense, but because not building one meant admitting technological inferiority in the one arena where Soviet prestige still competed. Space. The decision came down in February 1976, 5 years before Columbia flew. The Central Committee issued a decree. Develop a reusable spacecraft system comparable to the American Space Shuttle. The budget was essentially unlimited, which in Soviet terms meant whatever it takes until we run out of resources. The lead organization was NPO Energia, headed by Valentin Glushko, the brilliant and ruthless chief designer who'd spent decades building powerful rocket engines. The project was massive, spanning multiple locations. The orbiters were constructed in Moscow, the external fuel tank and boosters at Baikonur, and test facilities were scattered across the Soviet Union. Integration would happen at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, 2,000 kilometers from Moscow, in a desert that's like Mars in summer and the Arctic in winter. The scale was staggering from the beginning. It wasn't just one facility. It was an entire industrial ecosystem. NPO Energia coordinated, but 1,206 separate organizations contributed. Factories in Leningrad produced ceramic tiles. Software centers in Moscow developed code. Wind tunnels in Zhukovsky tested aerodynamics. American intelligence had underestimated how much technical data the KGB obtained about the space shuttle program. Detailed schematics, thermal protection specs, orbital maneuvering system designs. Not complete blueprints, but enough to reverse engineer fundamental concepts. The Buran orbiter looks nearly identical to the American shuttle for a reason. The physics of atmospheric re-entry doesn't care about ideology. A certain shape works. You can't redesign aerodynamics to be more socialist. But the Soviets made critical modifications. The American shuttle used its own main engines. Buran had none. The massive Energia rocket system provided all the thrust. The orbiter was essentially a glider with maneuvering thrusters. This decision changed everything. It meant Buran was lighter and the Energia rocket could be used for other missions. It also made the orbiter simpler, with fewer systems that could fail catastrophically. However, it also meant Buran was entirely dependent on the Energia rocket. You couldn't launch one without the other. Once the Energia rocket ignited, you were committed to orbit or to crashing. The Energia rocket itself was a masterpiece. 60 meters tall, 2,400 tons at launch. 4 liquid oxygen and kerosene boosters were strapped to a central core with liquid hydrogen and oxygen engines. It could lift 100 tons to low Earth orbit, compared to the space shuttle's 24 tons. Energia was the most powerful rocket the Soviets ever successfully launched. The construction timeline reveals the chaos beneath the ambition. Work began at Baikonur in 1977. The Soviets built what was essentially a giant climate-controlled clean room in the middle of the Kazakh desert, where temperatures swing from 45 degrees Celsius in summer to -35 in winter. At its peak in the mid-1980s, the workforce at Baikonur numbered around 60,000 people. They lived in the closed city of Leninsk, a complete society built for one purpose: launching spacecraft. The test program was extensive. They built a full-scale wooden mock-up to test ground handling and atmospheric test vehicles to practice landing. These tests revealed problems. The orbiter's glide ratio was terrible. It was like a brick with wings. The landing approach was terrifying, coming in steep and fast at 300 kilometers per hour. A pilot had one chance to get it right. There was no going around for another try. The numbers tell a story that photographs can't capture. The Buran program consumed approximately 20 billion rubles. In today's money, that's roughly 40 to 60 billion US dollars for a single successful orbital flight. The economics never made sense. But economics wasn't the point. Prestige was. The problem was that prestige doesn't pay salaries when the treasury runs empty. 4 orbiters were constructed. OK 1.01, the one that flew. OK 1.02, which was almost finished. And 2 others that were never completed. Each orbiter required about 38,000 ceramic heat-resistant tiles, individually shaped and attached by hand. The software development was perhaps the most impressive technical achievement. Buran's automated landing system used 4 redundant computers running independently developed software. It controlled over 600 functions during flight. The Americans had similar systems, but they'd never attempted a fully automated orbital flight and landing. Buran would be the first. Launch occurred at 3 a.m. UTC. The Energia rocket performed flawlessly. Buran entered orbit 8.5 minutes after liftoff and completed 2 orbits. The world watched, waiting to see if the Soviets could actually land this thing. Re-entry began over the Indian Ocean. The heat-resistant tiles glowed, reaching 1,650 degrees Celsius on the outside, while the inside remained at a comfortable 20 degrees. The tiles worked. The final approach happened in strong crosswinds, well above design specifications. The software adjusted. The orbiter came in slightly offset from the center line, corrected at 200 meters altitude, and touched down just 10 meters from its target. Fully automated. It was the most advanced automated landing ever achieved. The Americans wouldn't attempt something similar for another decade. The engineers in mission control knew they'd accomplished something extraordinary. They also knew it didn't matter. The Soviet Union was collapsing financially. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources. Chernobyl had destroyed public confidence in Soviet technology. The program officially continued for another 3 years, but everyone knew it was over. Funding dried up. The second orbital flight was postponed indefinitely. The workforce at Baikonur shrank by half. Then, in December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Buran program became Russia's problem, a country with a fraction of the budget and no political will to continue it. The orbiter sat in storage. OK 1.01, the flight vehicle, was moved to Hangar 112 at Baikonur for preservation. The facilities fell into disrepair. Launch pads sat empty. Hangars were deserted. In 1993, Russia officially canceled the Buran program. The orbiters would remain in storage for potential future use, which meant they were forgotten. Russia leased the Baikonur facility to Kazakhstan, but the lease didn't cover maintenance for unused buildings. Hangar 112 was a massive structure designed to protect spacecraft from extreme weather, but it required regular inspections and repairs. By 1995, those inspections stopped. By 2001, engineering assessments warned that structural failure was possible. The warnings went unheeded. Russia couldn't afford repairs. Kazakhstan didn't own the building. Nobody had the budget to fix a roof on a hangar storing a spacecraft that would never fly again. On May 12, 2002, a storm hit the Baikonur Cosmodrome. It was the kind of storm the massive hangar was built to withstand. But buildings, like dreams, need maintenance. The corroded trusses failed and the roof collapsed. 12,000 tons of steel and concrete fell 70 meters onto the spacecraft below. OK 1.01, the only Buran orbiter to ever reach orbit, was crushed. 8 workers performing unrelated tasks inside died in the collapse. The photos are haunting. Twisted metal, shattered ceramic tiles, and the tail of Buran peeking out from the debris. The spacecraft that survived re-entry at 28,000 kilometers per hour was destroyed by neglect at 0 kilometers per hour. Engineers who worked on Buran described it as attending a funeral for something they built with their own hands. But funerals acknowledge death. This felt more like discovering your life's work had been buried in a forgotten storage unit and left to rot. There were other orbiters. OK 1.02, the nearly complete backup, survived longer. It was sold to a private investor and eventually ended up abandoned in a Moscow parking lot, covered in graffiti, a plaything for children, and a backdrop for tourist selfies. It was finally moved to a museum in 2018, preserved, but as a relic, not a functional spacecraft. The unfinished orbiters were simply scrapped, their tiles sold as souvenirs, their airframes recycled. The facilities deteriorated right alongside the orbiters. The assembly building, once a pristine clean room, became a leaky warehouse. The massive runway, built just for Buran, cracked and buckled, with weeds growing through the pavement. The N-225 Mriya, the colossal aircraft built to carry Buran, survived the longest. It was repurposed for commercial cargo, a one-of-a-kind titan of the skies. Then, in February 2022, it was destroyed during the invasion of Ukraine. The symbolic weight of it all is almost unbearable. The human cost is even harder to quantify. 2.5 million people worked on the Buran program. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the project was cancelled, those specialized jobs vanished. Engineers who had perfected heat-resistant tiles found themselves unemployable. The brain drain from Russia's space sector was devastating. The city built to support them, Baikonur, saw its population get cut in half. Entire apartment blocks were abandoned. The city survives, but as a shadow of its former self, a place haunted by a future that never arrived. The economic analysis is brutal. $40 to $60 billion in today's money for one flight. 206 minutes in orbit. That's about $290 million per minute of spaceflight. The entire program cost as much as the Russian segment of the International Space Station. The return on investment was zero. So why build it? Yuri Semenov, a lead engineer, said it best. We knew the economics didn't make sense. We were building because not building would mean admitting we couldn't. We were building because the Americans had one and we needed to prove Soviet technology was equal or superior. It was the Cold War pathology in action. Both superpowers built incredibly expensive systems that barely worked, all to avoid appearing inferior. The Americans spent $200 billion over 135 missions to learn that reusable shuttles weren't cost-effective. The Soviets learned the same lesson for $40 billion after just one flight. The technical achievements, however, were staggering. Buran's fully automated landing was unprecedented. The Energia rocket was a masterpiece. Soviet engineers solved incredible problems with limited resources, proving their ingenuity and brilliance. But technical brilliance can't overcome economic reality. The Soviet Union simply couldn't afford it. The money spent on this prestige project could have modernized factories or improved infrastructure for its citizens. Instead, it went to a spacecraft that impressed the West but did nothing to stop the Soviet economy from collapsing. Could it have been saved? If they had focused on practicality instead of competition, maybe. If the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed, perhaps. But these are just hypotheticals. Circumstances weren't different. The outcome was set in stone the moment the program was conceived as a response to the American shuttle. Today, the ruins remain. The hangar is a skeletal wreck. The runway cracks a little more each year. The facility exists in 2 states at once, a functional spaceport and an industrial graveyard. Tourists can visit, but access is limited. The government doesn't maintain the ruins, but it doesn't want anyone getting hurt exploring them. So they just sit there, slowly being reclaimed by the desert. Buran's true legacy is proof that even superpowers have limits. Not because the engineers weren't capable, but because the economic foundation couldn't support the ambition. The program collapsed under its own weight before it ever had a chance to fly again. What's left are fragments. One orbiter in a museum, ruins at Baikonur, and interviews with elderly engineers who spent their careers on a dream that flew only once. It's a story of both triumph and tragedy. A monument to the heights of engineering and the depths of strategic miscalculation. The youngest people who worked on Buran are in their 60s now. They believed they were building the future. That belief died in the rubble of Hangar 112. But before it died, it produced something extraordinary, a spacecraft that flew itself to orbit and back. A demonstration that Soviet engineering could match anything in the world. And that demonstration cost them everything. The strangest part for those who remember is the silence. For over a decade, the program was a constant hum of activity. Now, there's only the wind blowing across empty launch pads and the sound of your own footsteps echoing in abandoned buildings. 206 minutes of automated spaceflight. 34 years of decay and counting. The story of Buran asks a fundamental question. What do we value? Achievement for its own sake? Prestige over practicality? The drive to match a rival, even if it bankrupts you? Those motivations built Buran, and those same motivations buried it. The spacecraft that survived re-entry couldn't survive indifference. The program that proved Soviet excellence couldn't prove its own necessity. And the ruins remain, rusting in the desert, a silent testament to what happens when ambition exceeds sustainability. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the history of technology and ambition.